In the autumn of 1487, the county of Veltmark, in the southern reaches of the Holy Roman Empire, was a place of quiet order. The hills rolled green and brown beneath skies that carried the weight of coming winter. Along the ridge above the village of Kessenbach stood the large house of the Erlenbach family, a stone and timber building that had overlooked those hills for 3 generations. Its walls were thick, its food stores were full, and its master, Heinrich von Erlenbach, understood that power was not taken by force, but passed down through family, and if carefully looked after, it could last forever. He was 51 years old that autumn, a man whose wife had passed away. His wife, Margaret, had died of fever 6 years before. Since then, Katrine managed the household. A woman of 23 with her mother's careful ways and her father's stubborn intelligence. Below her in the household were 2 sons, Wilhelm, 19, already training with the local soldiers. Young Conrad, 13, spent most of his days in the house's small library reading maps and trade papers. Heinrich had no shortage of pride when he looked at his children. They were well organized, they were able. They would carry on what he had built. The Erlenbachs controlled the fees on the Kessenbach river crossing, a small but steady source of income. That had, over time, grown into the right to cut trees on the eastern hillsides and a family claim to settle arguments. Among 6 nearby villages, they were not among the highest nobles. They held no title above that of minor lord. But in the world of local influence, Heinrich von Erlenbach was very important. Merchants depended on him, farmers paid him, and the regional manager in Feldkirn, Albrecht Grauer, had relied on Heinrich's knowledge of the valley for nearly 10 years. It was a life of repetition and routine. Mornings began with the ringing of the house bell at sunrise when the servants drew water, and the cook began the fire. Heinrich would meet with his household manager Bauer to look over accounts. Then came letters, messages from merchants, requests from villagers, the occasional note from Feldkirn. Midday brought the household together at the long table in the great hall. Evenings were quieter. Katrin would read near the fire. Wilhelm would sharpen his blade or play at cards with the guards. Conrad would fall asleep at his desk, surrounded by papers he pretended to understand. There was nothing in those autumn weeks to suggest that anything was about to change. The harvest had been average, not plentiful, but enough. The roads were usable. The river ran at a normal level. Heinrich had recently settled a land argument between 2 farming families without either side turning to fighting, which he considered a personal success. He had written to Grauer in Feldkirn with a request for a renewal of his crossing fees. A routine matter he expected to be resolved before the first snow. But there was something else happening in those same weeks. Something that moved beneath the surface of daily life, like a current beneath still water. Heinrich had become aware through careful listening that the Rettenbach family, longtime rivals from the nearby valley, had been meeting with officials in Feldkirn. The Rettenbachs had long argued against the Erlenbachs' claim to the eastern tree-cutting rights, a disagreement that went back 40 years to a poorly written family paper that both families read in ways that served their own interests. For years, the argument had been quiet. Both families were wise enough to know that open fighting was costly and rarely settled anything. But something had changed. Heinrich had received word, through his household manager Bauer, that a Rettenbach representative, a man named Dieter, had made 3 separate visits to the manager's office in Feldkirn. Within the span of 6 weeks, 3 visits. No one made 3 visits to a manager for a friendly chat, and Bauer, who had contacts among the town's writers, had reported that papers were being prepared. What those papers contained, he could not say. His contact had been turned away before he could read them. Heinrich was not a man given to worry. He had worked through arguments before. He believed, with the confidence of someone who had always won, that the system would protect him, that his long relationship with Grauer, his loyalty to the regional management, his 3 generations of unquestioned time on the land, would count for more than whatever the Rettenbachs were putting together. He wrote to Grauer again. He received a reply that was warm in tone and said nothing of real value. It was in the 3rd week of October that he received the strangest letter of all. It came from a man named Lorenz Fehler, a legal paper writer in Feldkirchen whom Heinrich had used occasionally for legal work. It was short, no more than 5 lines, and it said only that Fehler hoped Heinrich was in good health, that he had recently completed some work on behalf of a person he could not name, and that if Heinrich had reason to visit Feldkirchen before winter, it might be worth a conversation. That was all. No urgency, no specific concern, just a soft, unclear invitation. Heinrich read the letter twice. He set it on his desk. He told no one about it. He planned to ride to Feldkirchen the following week. He never went. On the morning of November 4th, 1487, servants of Erlenbach House rose as usual at sunrise. The bell was rung. The fire was lit in the kitchen. The cook, Elsa, sent her helper to the main house to collect the morning order. The helper returned pale-faced and empty-handed. The hall was empty. The long table had been set the night before, and was still set. The candles had burned down. The chairs were in their places. Nothing had been turned over. The bread from the previous evening's meal was still on the board, partly eaten. Elsa went herself to check the sleeping rooms. Each room was as it should be. Beds made or slept in, clothing folded or hanging, personal belongings untouched. Heinrich's sword, which he was never without when he traveled, was on its hook. Katrin's sewing frame stood by the window with her work still threaded. Wilhelm's boots, the good riding boots, were under his bed. Conrad's maps and books lay open on his desk, held down by an ink bottle. Of the family, all 4 of them, there was no sign. The guards were questioned. Neither had seen anyone leave. Neither had heard anything unusual. The gate had not been opened. The stable showed nothing out of place. 4 horses stood calmly in their stalls. No cart had been taken. No food was missing. By mid-morning, the servants had gathered in the yard and word had spread to Kessenbach village. By afternoon, several farmers had come up the hill to see for themselves. They found what the servants had found, a house that looked exactly as it should, lived in by every outward sign by people who were no longer there. The village elder, Conrad Huber, stood in the great hall for a long time without speaking. Then he said that they should send word to Feldkirchen. It took 3 days for the message to reach the regional manager and 3 more before Grauer sent anyone. The man he sent was Rolf Steinmann, a careful, thorough court worker in his late 30s. He was known for asking the same question many different ways until he received an answer that satisfied him. Steinmann arrived on a gray morning and spent the first day simply walking around the property. He spoke to the servants one by one, beginning with Elsa and working his way through the staff. He looked at the gate. He looked at the road, muddy from recent rain. He found a few boot prints near the road, but they were unclear and could have belonged to the farmers. On the second day, Steinmann turned his attention to the letters. Heinrich had kept his letters in a locked box. The box had been left unlocked. Steinmann worked through the papers carefully, making notes. He found everyday letters, merchant accounts, legal papers, requests from villagers. He found 3 letters from the regional manager, each one warmer than the last but no more useful, and he found the letter from Lorenz Fehler, the legal paper writer. He held Fehler's letter for some time, then he set it aside, in a separate pile, and said nothing about it to anyone that evening. On the 3rd day, Steinmann talked with the village elder, Huber. Huber told him about the Ruttenbach family and their recent visits to Feldkirchen. Huber was careful about what he said, but made clear that the timing was worth noting. Steinmann wrote it down. He also noticed that Huber himself seemed frightened, not of the mystery, of something else, something he was choosing not to name. Steinmann visited the legal paper writer Fehler in Feldkirchen on his return journey. He found the office closed. A neighbor told him that Fehler had left the city 4 days earlier. Before Steinmann had even arrived at the house, on a journey he had described as personal, he had not said when he expected to return. The official report that Steinmann filed with the regional management was thorough and carefully written. It described the events around the disappearance, the condition of the house, the statements of the servants and villagers, and the lack of any proof pointing to fighting or the family leaving by force. It noted the unsettled argument with the Ruttenbach family. It noted the open question of the fee renewal. It noted Fehler's absence, and then it suggested that the matter be listed as a disappearance of unknown cause. that the house be placed under official management while waiting for the family's return or the decision of their legal standing, and that further looking into the matter be done by the court in Feldkirn. The court in Feldkirn did nothing. The official management of the house was set up within a month, run by a man chosen directly by Albrecht Grauer. Within the following spring, the Eastern tree-cutting rights, the rights that had been argued over for 40 years between the Erlenbachs and the Ruttenbachs, were officially given away. The paperwork stated a finding that the Erlenbach claim was not properly supported due to the family's unknown legal standing. The rights were given to the Ruttenbach family. The crossing fees on the river were given to the regional management itself and rented out to a group of merchants in which, it would later be found, Albrecht Grauer held a personal financial interest. Within 2 years, the house was being used by a land worker on behalf of the merchant group. The servants had all gone their separate ways. Elsa the cook went to live with her sister in the next valley. Most of the others found work elsewhere, and over time stopped talking about what they had seen. A few of the younger ones moved far enough away that no one ever thought to ask them. The case was never formally closed. It was never formally opened with any seriousness. It faded into the group of things that people whispered about in taverns and then forgot. Years passed. Then more years. The house changed hands twice more. The village of Kiesenbach grew slowly and then stopped growing. The crossing bridge was rebuilt in stone in 1511, and the record of the Erlenbach family's connection to it was not included in the new papers. By the time a generation had passed, the disappearance of the Erlenbachs had become a story told to children, something between a ghost tale and a careful warning about what happened when important people left important things behind. The specific details became unclear. The family's name was sometimes remembered correctly, and sometimes changed slightly in the retelling. The political background disappeared entirely, leaving only the image of an empty house with a set table and untouched boots under a bed. It became legend. And legend by its nature asks no serious questions. In the winter of 1538, 51 years after the disappearance, the house was being repaired by its current owners. A section of the western outer wall, which had developed a worrying crack, was being strengthened by a team of workers. In the process of digging along the base of the wall, one of the men found something that brought the work to a stop. At first they thought it was animal remains. Then they realized the bones were too many, too large, and too carefully placed to be anything but human. The workers called for the local priest, who came and looked, and then sent for the town officer of Kessenbach, who had by that time replaced the old position of village elder. What they found, over the following days of careful digging, was the remains of 5 people. The bones were badly broken down after 5 decades in wet earth, but enough survived for the examining doctor, a man brought from Feldkirn, to determine that all 5 had been adults, that at least 2 were female, and that at least 1 showed signs of being hit hard on the head. The others showed no clear signs of how they died, which was consistent with either a hit that left no mark on the bones or with other ways entirely. 5 people. But the Erlenbach family had numbered 4. The question of who the 5th person was would not be answered for another several years. But the discovery of the remains immediately brought back the memory of the disappearance in ways that 50 years of silence had not. The town officer, whose name was Georg Altmann, a thorough and somewhat stubborn man, began putting together what he could find of the original case. Steinmann's report had survived in the Feldkirn records, filed in a drawer labeled Various Civil Matters. Altmann read it carefully. He noted the parts about Fehler, the legal paper writer, about the Ruttenbach visits to Feldkirn, about the crossing fees and the tree-cutting claims. He noted the official management and the later handovers. Then he went looking for the people who were still alive. Elsa the cook was 73 years old and living with her niece in a village 12 miles to the west. Altmann made the journey himself. He found her sharp-minded and, when she understood why he had come, willing to speak in ways she had not spoken before. She told him that on the night of the 3rd of November, the night before the family was discovered missing, she had heard sounds from the direction of the main house sometime after midnight. She had assumed it was one of the guards making a round, or perhaps Conrad, the youngest child, who sometimes crept to the kitchen for bread when he could not sleep. She had not gotten up to look into it. She had not mentioned this in her original statement because, she said, she had been afraid. A man she did not recognize had come to the kitchen door 2 days before the discovery and told her without explanation that she would be wise to keep to what she had seen and say nothing about what she might have heard. That detail had never appeared in any official record. Altman also found, in the Feldkirn records, a secondary file that had been put in the wrong place, placed inside a larger bundle of land records from the 1490s, rather than in the civil matters drawer where it belonged. Inside were 3 papers. The first was a copy of Fehler the legal paper writer's letter to Heinrich von Erlenbach, the warm but unclear letter suggesting a conversation before winter. The second was a draft of an alternative family ownership plan for the Erlenbach house, written in Fehler's hand, which named the Ruttenbach family as backup claimants under certain conditions of the family having no heirs or walking away from their legal rights. The third was a letter in a different hand, formal, official in tone, which directed Fehler to prepare the draft and assured him that the necessary steps were being taken to bring about the needed conditions. This letter was signed by Albrecht Grauer. Grauer had been dead for 11 years by the time Altman read this letter. The Ruttenbach family still controlled the eastern tree-cutting rights. The merchant group that held the crossing lease had broken up, its members long gone or deceased. What Altman could piece together, and what he wrote in a careful report that he submitted to the Feldkirn court, and that the court accepted, noted, and then did nothing useful about, was this. In the autumn of 1487, Heinrich von Erlenbach had been in the way. His crossing fees and his tree-cutting claims stood between 2 interested parties, Albrecht Grauer, the regional manager, and the Ruttenbach family, and a significant financial gain. The legal ways of removing him were slow, uncertain, and likely to fail given Heinrich's well-known good name and his connections within the management. The argued tree-cutting claim was 40 years old and would require years of court fighting to resolve. With no guaranteed outcome, someone, and Altman believed the proof pointed, though could not show conclusively, toward working together between Grauer and the head of the Ruttenbach family at that time. A man named Ernst von Ruttenbach had chosen a more direct solution. The family had been taken from the house in the deep hours of the night of the 3rd of November. They had been killed and buried against the western outer wall of their own home, a wall thick enough and stone enough that no casual looking would have found anything. The 5th person in the grave was most likely the legal paper writer Fehler, who had been helpful in the preparation of the official papers, and who had perhaps afterward become someone who knew too much. His disappearance, unlike the Erlenbachs, had gone entirely unnoticed. A single man with no house, no family ownership claim, no servants to notice his absence. The guards who had been on watch that night, the men who had reported seeing nothing, had both left Kessenbach within a month of the disappearance and were never found. The servants had been warned into silence by ways Altman could not fully prove but could easily imagine. Steinmann, the person sent to look into it, had written his careful report and filed it, and then apparently considered his responsibility finished. Whether he had known more than he wrote was a question that could no longer be answered. He too was dead. Grauer's letter to Fehler remained the single most direct piece of surviving proof. It was enough to show that the legal moves following the disappearance were not accidental. It was not enough to punish anyone for anything, even if there had been anyone left to punish. Altman's report was submitted. It was filed. A church service was held in the Kessenbach church for the souls of the Erlenbach family. A stone marker was placed near the site of the digging, though the remains themselves were moved to the village churchyard for proper burial. The eastern tree-cutting rights remained with the family that had received them. The crossing fee remained under official control. The law, which had been twisted to allow the crime, was not willing to undo its own earlier decisions, particularly when those decisions had stood unchallenged for half a century, and the parties who gained from it were not the same parties who had planned the arrangement. There was no giving back of what was taken. There was no punishment. There was only the record, Altman's careful report, Steinmann's original investigation, Fehler's draft papers, and the letter with Grauer's signature, sitting together in a file in the Feldkirn records, correctly filed this time, where it remained for centuries. History is rarely an act of justice. It is more often an act of recording, The slow building up of proof about what powerful people chose to do when they believed no one was watching, and what careful, stubborn people like Altman chose to do with what they found. The Erlenbach family left no living descendants. Their name faded from the land papers and the crossing records and the official letters of the valley. But the bones were found. The papers survived. And someone eventually asked the right questions in the right order. What the stone marker in the Kessenbach churchyard says is simple. It gives the family's name. It gives the approximate year of their deaths. It says that they were members of this community for 3 generations, that they were removed by the actions of others, and that they are remembered. It does not say who was responsible. It does not need to. The record exists. The truth buried for 50 years beneath a foundation wall did not stay buried. It rarely does, not because justice is certain, but because the earth has poor memory for secrets and because there is always eventually someone who will notice that the table is set and the boots are under the bed and the people are gone, and who will refuse to let that be the end of the story. Heinrich von Erlenbach had believed that the system would protect him. He was wrong about that, but he had been a man of records, a man who kept letters, who filed papers, who maintained accounts. And in the end, it was the habit of keeping records that he had lived within, and that Fehler and Grauer had also lived within and been too careless to entirely destroy, that spoke for him and for his family when they could no longer speak for themselves. The autumn light in the valley of Kessenbach falls now as it fell then, low and amber across the hills, catching the stone walls of buildings that have been built and rebuilt over centuries on land that passed through many hands. The bridge across the river is concrete now. The tree-cutting rights have been absorbed into state forestry. The official structures that Grauer managed are unrecognizable in form, though not entirely in character. And somewhere in an archive, in a folder correctly filed, the letter with Grauer's signature waits, patient, precise, unchanged. A quiet record of what was done and by whom, and what it cost a family who had asked for nothing more than to remain on the land their grandfather had built upon, tending the accounts, watching the river, ringing the bell at sunrise. They were ordinary in the way that most human lives are ordinary, defined not by great deeds but by being present, by showing up each day by the slow building up of days. And the crime committed against them was ordinary too in its way, driven by greed, made possible by authority, protected by silence. It was not unique in history. It was not even unusual, but it was real, and it is remembered. And that in the end is the only answer that silence fears.